Why, though? Why do we write specifically about the future, right? Because it's one thing to dream of the future, it's another thing to write about it. And we are reading a lot of writing. So, why do we write about the future? Um, One thing is to make predictions and to share warning messages. These can be really mundane, like a tornado watch or a fire forecast, or they can be more like extreme, like there's an app that people have in California that predicts earthquakes. And when I was a kid growing up, I'm from Los Angeles, relevant to this story. When I was a kid growing up, we didn't have anything like that. So, you'd just like be minding your own business and then there'd be an earthquake. And now there's this app that can give you a little bit of advanced warning, which gives you time to like not be driving on the highway, maybe, um, which is not where you want to be in an earthquake. To climate emergency reports, like you'll see a lot of like scientific documents come out that are shared at things like GOP, not GOP, COP, like COP20, whatever, those like big global climate conferences, or UN reports, like things that predict and warn about like climate degradation, the fallout of the climate crisis. And then even something as extreme as the doomsday clock, which I can't ask you if you know what the doomsday clock is. So for those of you who do know, cool. If you don't, it's a little clock um, that takes down seconds, like minutes to seconds to midnight, and midnight is the apocalypse, or that's their argument. And it's this rhetorical tool used by a bunch of scientists who are particularly concerned about nuclearism and the risk of nuclear war. But they are also concerned about other threats to human civilization, and they make a prediction every year about how close we are to global catastrophe, and it's referenced by the time of this clock. They set the clock every year, um, and that's sort of their way of making predictions about the future, warnings about the future. But those warnings are less situated in like, here's what we genuinely really think is going to happen. I mean, they are worried about that happening. They're worried about that as a possibility, but really the message is a warning intended to influence people's actions in the present, right? Because that's what warnings are about. If I warn you not to text and drive, it's not because I think you're going to text and drive and get hit by a car. It's because I'm worried that you might, and I want to ensure that you don't by getting you to act differently today. Um, so that's a really straightforward example, but these can also be and frequently are much more complicated allegorical messages. So a great example of that is how reading the Hunger Games, Suzanne Collins has come out and said, like, the Hunger Games is a critique of American media during the 2003, basically starting in and going on from the 2003 beginning of the war in Iraq. So she described this horrible sort of series of reflections based on turning on the TV to news footage about the war in Iraq, intercut with celebrity fluff stories about gossip and the Met Gala and like these beautiful outfits that people are wearing while children are dying in wars that fund the GDP that funds that kind of glamour and opulence. Um, so she writes this book as a critique about the media landscape and how it gives us distractions that keep us from trying to intervene in structures of violence. So that's kind of why panem is called panem. Bread and circuses is panem et circenses. It's this Latin phrase of political commentary that means, you can do what you want if you give the people their bread and their circuses, if you keep them fed and entertained. Um, so what this book is trying to influence you to do or think is a bit more nebulous because you can do with a lot with that shift in perspective. It's not a binary choice of texting and driving or wearing sunscreen or not wearing sunscreen or not texting and driving. Um, you can do a lot with that, depending on your politics and what you think. The point is, it's getting you to think about that. Um, Another reason we write about the future is to imagine other possibilities of life that are different from our lives today or our lives in history. This is why, in addition to sci fi, you'll hear the term speculative fiction a lot. because not all works that interrogate possibility are scientific in their aesthetics or basis. A lot of them are other kinds of imagination. Um, Mostly imaginary speculative work involves presenting a mix of different possibilities, some of which are in conflict with each other or even outright war. And the idea is that in looking at how different groups of people respond to a crisis, you can imagine other possibilities for how life might be organized and laid out and what it might look like under different political regimes. A lot of speculative fiction is political in nature, for the same reasons that a lot of futurism is political in nature. It's trying to get us to imagine worlds, and worlds are very much structured by the politics of the people who make them up. So, in a lot of these sort of speculative allegorical tales, um, some of them are also sci-fi. I do want to make that clear because, like, a great example of this is the Galactic Empire, or sorry, Star Wars is a great example of this. So is The Matrix. So a lot of these are science fictions. And we're gonna come back to Star Wars, The Matrix, and The Hunger Games a lot because they are widely recognizable material, which makes them good examples. So, in sci fi and speculative fiction, when you're imagining other possibilities for life, typically you're being shown different possibilities in conflict with some threat. And this threat is usually an imperial or dictatorial force. Think the Galactic Empire, think the Matrix itself, like the computers and the agents that make them up. And the capital is another good example. And then these texts will often also present various ways in which communities and individuals respond to that force. Um, so we're not going to get into the nitty gritty of like who is like who is a Democrat, who's a conservative, like who's a Republican, who is a leftist, things like that. Because it's very hard to ascribe labels like that to fictional characters. The nitty gritty of those aside, many positions can be summed up as follows, and these terms come from political science. A lot of political scientific literature, journal articles, analysis works by talking about these different drives towards these different routes of response to a threat of change in your political regime. One is resistance, which is this tendency to resist changes that might worsen a bad situation. This could be like fighting against new laws, funding reallocations, or wars. The idea is about conserving a prior status quo. Another response is reformation, which is working to change systems otherwise from how they are being changed by whatever dictatorial force one is responding to. So, an example of that would be working to expand poll hours so more people can vote, subsidizing childcare, providing universal health insurance, working to fix the prison system. This is the prison system example is a really good one because when we talk about a reformation in contemporary America, we're often talking about people talking about prison reform or carceral reform and how to make the justice system more just. It's a pretty common way in which this term is used. Another more radical example or response is revolution, which is when people decide that a system in power is irredeemable and fundamentally flawed, and then work to dismantle and rebuild or replace it. 1776, the American Revolution, a great example of that. And then there's another one that has a lot of different terms that are used to describe it. One is escape, one is refusal, and this is the idea of refusing to participate or leaving the system entirely. This is the least well defined of these categories because it by nature typically is sort of outside of these standards of political science because it is a politics of not politicking, basically. There are a number of indigenous politics of refusal. Audra Simpson, who is a Kanien'kehá:ka scholar, wrote this book called Mohawk Interruptus, which talks a lot about refusal to be the colonized native subject that the US government often demands. It's a great book. Highly recommend you read it. Bit outside of the scope of this class. And it's also the refusal is also a common anarchist position or escape from structures of domination or governance. Sometimes it's really easy to see these sort of political trends in a work of futurist literature. For instance, in the Hunger Games, Katniss's popularity pushes some capital residents towards resistance or reform, right? When they start crying out for there to be exceptions made for her and PETA, or rules protecting pregnant people from being raped for the Hunger Games, um, or even like some resistance to the Hunger Games itself. Meanwhile, Plutarch, Gale, and District 13 are revolutionary, right? They're working to dismantle the system and replace it, specifically with the presidency with President Coyne at the top. And then Haymitch and Katniss are much more on the angle of refusal or escape, right? They are not focused on tearing down the system and replacing it with a different state. They're more interested in stopping this system from harming people so that they can live their lives and their loved ones can live their lives. It's just a different orientation towards what future you might want. Andor is another good example of this. We've got the Rebel Alliance, which is a revolutionary kind of force in the world, but within it, there's quite a lot of political diversity. So you've got figures like Senator Mon Mothma, who is much more reformist, while there are other figures like Nemik and Andor who lean more towards refusal or escape. Sometimes it's a lot harder, though. So in Parable of the Sower, it's very hard to figure out the politics of the characters. And this is because, unlike a lot of these examples are media that have been by design are here to sort of allegorize politics through these very clear archetypal examples. Like, that's not to say the characters aren't complicated, they are, but their political motivations are very straightforward. Whereas in Parable of the Sower, it's the characters and their politics are a lot more complicated. Uh, it's a lot harder for us to sort of apply these categories. And that's because these categories are a handy rule of thumb, but they're not an ironclad truth, right? The reason you can ascribe them to figures like Andor or Katniss Everdeen are because figures like Andor and Katniss Everdeen are also handy rules of thumb for us to understand our current political world, just like these rules are. But when we're trying to describe each other or characters that read much more like a conflict riddled and incoherent individual, like a person in your daily life who can't make sense of their own politics, that's a lot realer. It's a lot more nuanced, it's a lot more specific, and it's a lot more based in our situation, our context, our personal perspective, and how our lives have been than a simple category could really cover. So that's why figures like Lauren are a lot harder to place. And we'll get into that more. But for now, where do our ideas of the future come from? Right? Because we're trying to imagine a future, but we can't just like sit down and think, I'm going to come up with a thing that no one has come up with before, right? That's like sitting down and being asked to imagine a color that isn't on the rainbow. You can imagine the idea of a color that isn't on the rainbow, but you can't picture it. A lot of our futurist stories, therefore, are kind of combed from and built out of ideas we have in the present and ideas we have in the past. So in the present, it's very easy. Well, we have cars today. Maybe in the future, we'll have flying cars. And then in the past, a lot of past political anesthetic and sort of like past existential threats often shape futurist narratives. So Civil War is a big one. Firefly, which was a much beloved cult classic sci-fi show from the early 2000s, was actually entirely based on this Civil War novel called The Killer Angels. And the browncoats in Firefly are actually based on sort of lost cause Confederate soldiers. So that's fascinating, because if you know Firefly, you know that they're presented very non-ambiguously as the heroes of the story, or fairly non-ambiguously. So that's a lot to think about that's outside the scope of our course. Why I'm bringing it up right now is simply because it's a great example of a futurist narrative that is entirely built out of reckoning with the past. So to understand futurism, we have to understand history. specifically that history is not a dead thing. This painting over here is by Paul Klee of Bauhaus School. It's called Angelus Novus, and it's often used to talk about history because a famous theorist who I'm not going to make you read, but I will recommend, Walter Benjamin, um, who was a Frankfurt School cultural critic and theorist, sort of coming out of the Marxist space, but not a Marxist. And he was one of these like influential cultural critics who wrote a lot about like what it means to deal with history and to live in history. Um, and he wrote an analysis of this painting as the angel of history and the way it is staring at like the accumulating clutter and change of decades and lives. Um, Basically, history is it built our present, right? We're here because of our history. If you hadn't decided to go to IU, you wouldn't be in this class. If you hadn't decided to take this class, I wouldn't be talking to you right now. If I hadn't decided to work at IU, I wouldn't be teaching this class. So our present is shaped by our history. Um, but it's not just because the choices made in the past shape the choices made in the present. It's also because the power structures that shape our reality today also shaped our history, right? If colleges didn't exist, we wouldn't have this class. Um, that's a very neutral example, but this is normally when we're talking about these power structures and their effect on history, we're talking about things like sexism, racism, classism, and these dynamics between groups with privilege and groups that are oppressed, and the structures that that lead to privilege and oppression being inequitably allocated, right? So slavery, for instance, because slavery existed for so long, um, American society, which was from its beginning for quite a long time a structure built on the profits of slavery and the violence of slavery, is baked into the structures of the society, literally in the fingerprints and thumbprints of enslaved people who made the bricks that made historic buildings, and also um, materially in the ways in which white families have generational wealth that a lot of black families do not, simply because they were not able to have wealth at all for generations. Economic disenfranchisement of black people comes out of the history of enslavement. Um, Racism in the present era is shaped by Jim Crow racism and segregation, which is shaped by dehumanization under the Three-Fifths Compromise, which is shaped by dehumanization under enslavement. There's a lot of excellent writing about this. If you want to read more about this, I highly recommend the work of Hortense Spillers, particularly Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe, which is an essay of hers, and also In the Wake by Christina Sharp, which is a longer work. There's a ton of books about this, and it's very important to thinking about the relationship between history and present, and therefore the relationship between history and future, because the future is shaped by our present and our history. So, there's another way that this works too, though, which is not only do these power structures shape literally what happens and the lives that people have access to, it also shapes what we archive and what is recorded in history. So history is written, right? Um, or orally passed down. But what is passed down depends on what the people doing the archiving consider important. Um, so if you go to like a formal archive in a library, chances are what's in that library is going to be shaped by what the people who built and funded the library thought was important. So if you're living in a society where certain groups of people are not considered human, say a slave state, um, the inner lives of enslaved Africans and their descendants are not going to be something that is recorded in that archive. We're not going to get the diaries of enslaved people because they weren't allowed to keep diaries. We're not going to get their oral narratives because, for the most part, they were not preserved. Um, we're not going to know necessarily the names of people. We might know some of their names where they entered books of sale, but is the name that a person is sold under really the name that they were born under? Especially if they were kidnapped and presumably renamed on that journey? No. Quite a lot of what is true in people's lives is lost to history because they are not prioritized by those keeping the records. This is something called archival silence, archival violence, because it is a violent process of sort of in recording people only through these like violent interactions where pieces of themselves have been taken, right? A deed of sale of a person, or a criminal record, or um, an article in the newspaper about an escaped slave that describes you by your scars, not by anything else, because that is all you are to those doing the describing, a series of scars on a body that could be used for profit. You see where this is going, right? This language, this linguistic erasure, um, creates a history that is full of holes and silences that often pertain to those on the margins of society or exploited by societal structures of violence. The trite way of saying this is history is written by the victors. Um, Another way of saying it is that history is situated and contextual and alive because these silences echo through time today. How can we talk about what we don't know? How can we talk about what we cannot name? So when we're writing history, we are continuing this erasure simply by writing only about what was recorded and not about what wasn't. These histories become present because every engagement with these archives normalizes this erasure and reifies this erasure and continues it. So these same marginalized communities are denied the existence of these histories, their own ancestors' interior lives and stories, because there's no formal recognized archival evidence of them. Now, we know about this problem, right? Because we're talking about this problem. But how do we work around it? How do we give voices to the voiceless, specifically those who have been silenced, without writing over what traces of them do live on, right? Because if we just write, oh, well, this is what they were like and this is what they did, we're making that up, right? That's still silencing them. So what do we do with that problem? And there's a lot of historians who have made that exact problem their whole thing. One is Marissa Fuentes, who writes a lot about stretching what history is there and making space for possibility and imagining within the gaps in the narrative. And another more famous, honestly, example would be Saidiya Hartman. So Saidiya Hartman is a professor at Columbia who writes through a method called critical fabulation, which is using context, so historical context, art, music, culture, trends, and things like that to sort of pull counter narratives from the shadows of history. Um, so her most famous book is a book called Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments. I highly recommend it. That's what this little note on method that I had you read comes from. And it sort of talks about the speculative history that she's engaging in. So, in her words, the endeavor is to recover the insurgent ground of these lives, to exhume open rebellion from the case file, to illuminate the radical imagination and everyday anarchy of ordinary colored girls, which had not only been overlooked, but is nearly unimaginable. In this spirit, I have pressed at the limit of the case file and the document, speculated about what might have been, imagined the things whispered in dark bedrooms, and amplified moments of withholding, escape, and possibility. Moments when the vision and dreams of the wayward seem possible. Methodologically, this is very similar to speculative futurist literature, only it tells the stories of real women, speculative narrative stories of these real people in the past. So it's very similar in method to speculative futurism. It's just talking about the past, not the future. But because the past shapes and continues to influence our present and our future by extension, these are very interconnected projects. So Hartman elaborates, again, back to using her words, elaborates, augments, transposes, and breaks open archival documents so they might yield a richer picture of the social upheaval that transformed Black life in the 20th century. If you like this concept, highly recommend reading more saidiya Hartman. But yeah, what we are doing in this class is looking at the ways in which historical, present, and futurist texts can be broken open, and can break open our understandings of America as a nation, as a project, and as a force for change in the world, and what we want to do with that. How do we understand our present moment of instability and violence through the warnings of the future and the past? We engage with the past and the future through our present as means for understanding it and working to change or improve it. So, yeah, when we imagine possible futures, they're not only structured by the past and the present, they're also a mirror to these, because we're writing for our present selves, right? We're not writing futurist novels for people to read in the future and go, that never happened, silly past thoughts. No, we're using the future as a tool to tell ourselves things that we need to know now, because the future isn't guaranteed. Um, Checking the time. This has already been going for kind of a long time, so we're going to skip this slide. Why futurism as a lens for studying America? America is a future-oriented project. We're going to keep getting into this every week. Territorial expansion is futurist, right? Why do you need that territory? You're imagining doing something with it. Revolution and new state formation, the American dream, manifest destiny, capitalism, right? Amassing profits for future, as always, a future-looking project, more and more and more profit. We'll talk about this a lot in the future. I'm gonna check the time because we might actually just want to keep going in. Oh yeah, it's been about an hour. That's plenty. So what we're going to do is we're going to hold off on discussing revolutions in the last two sources for the week until next time. And because we're just starting the book anyway, Parable, we'll only have so much to talk about when it comes to the first 5 chapters of Parable, because it's really sort of like setting the tone and laying the land and establishing the world and the characters. So we're going to do the last half of class for the week on the Thomas Paine, the documentary, and the first 5 chapters of Parable of the Square. So yeah, thank you for coming to lecture 1, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.